Welcome to the CHCI Leadership Conference Breakout Session. By the People, Latinos at the Polls. Our panel chair for today's session is Representative Ruben Gallego, who represents the 7th District of Arizona. Representative Gallego is a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the House Natural Resources Subcommittee. Our moderator for today's panel conversation is Russell Contreras, a race and justice reporter at Axios and co-author of the Axios Latino newsletter. He covers race, ethnicity, immigration, politics, and Latino issues. And now, please welcome our opening remarks speaker, Representative Ruben Gallego.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Representative Ruben Gallego. I represent Arizona's 7th District. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this CHCI breakout session by the people, Latinos at the polls. If 2020 has taught us anything, it is that the Latino electorate is diverse, it's growing, and it's influential. Latinos were consequential to the results of the 2020 presidential election, and our influence in local and national elections only continues to grow. The most recent numbers from the Census Bureau reveal that Latinos now make up over 18% of the total U.S. population. But to ensure the representation of the growing number of Latinos in our country, politicians, community, and business leaders, all of us must ensure that we take the time to listen to the community and encourage them not only to turn out to vote, but increasingly to run for public office. We also must ensure that Latinos aren't targeted by voter suppression, which is why I've left efforts in Congress to ban voter suppression laws that disproportionately impact Latinos and other communities of color. Passing voter rights protection laws are essential both for the survival of our democracy and to ensure that Latinos have a seat at the table. So now is the perfect time to have this discussion about how to elevate Latino voices at the local, state, and national level in ways that benefit all Americans. I've been proud to work with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus on these issues, and I'm thrilled to have so many of you participate in the panel today. Thank you again for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Russell Contreras, and I am the Race and Justice Reporter at Axios. I'm pleased to be here to moderate this important conversation titled By the People, Latinos at the Polls. Thank you, Representative Gallegos, for your remarks, and thank you to CHCI for providing a platform to discuss this timely and important topic. Nearly a third of Latinos voters participated in the 2020 presidential election when compared to the 2016 election, making a powerful 10.6% of the country's electorate. As Latinos grow in numbers, as evidenced by the 2020 census, Americans continue to elect more Latinos to public office, and a record-breaking 4 Latinos were confirmed to President Biden's cabinet. This session will discuss how to promote and sustain Latino civic participation, the momentum, and ensure equal representation in congressional redistricting, bolstering voter protections, and protecting our nation's democratic values. We want to hear from you, our audience. Go to social media and hashtag at CHCIHHM21. I'll repeat that again. Hashtag CHCIHHM21. I'm pleased to introduce an excellent group of panelists. They will share their take on how we think about and sustain Latino civic participation and the momentum we're seeing across the country. Our first panelist, Clarissa Martinez de Castro. She is the Deputy Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Unidos US. They are the largest national Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the US. Clarissa knows the Latino Vote well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Russell. It's wonderful to be with you. And thanks to CHCI for putting together this exciting conversation.
Our next panelist is Matt Barreto. He is a professor of political science and the co-founder of the Latino Politics and Policy Initiative at UCLA. He knows the data. He knows the Latino Vote. Matt, thank you for joining us.
All right, Russell, it's great to be here and just love being here with Clarissa and Chuck, and this is a great panel. Looking forward to it.
And our final panelist is my good homie from Texas, Chuck Rocha. He is a longtime political advisor and strategist, and he's head of the political consulting firm Solidarity Strategy. He has worked on a number of political campaigns over the years, including most recently Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. Chuck, it's great to be with you. Thanks for joining us.
Russell, thank you, and thanks CHCI for having all of us. And as Matt said, it's good to be here with all my friends.
Well, thank you. Let's just jump right into it. I want to give each of you a chance, about a minute or so, to give us your idea of the Latino vote. A lot of times, in campaigns, it comes up, elections. What do we understand and misunderstand about the Latino vote or Latino votes? Clarissa, I'll start with you.
I think that those who are from the community and work with the community see the vote clearly. We are not a monolith, but there is also great affinity on the issues that we care about. The thing that boggles the mind really is more that those who are seeking to engage the community or court it continue to miss that. There's very low level of outreach to the Latino electorate, and yet when Latino voters don't come out, candidates or parties tend to blame the community for work that the candidates or parties didn't do. So again, we are not a monolith, but there is a great deal of affinity on the issues, the aspirations, and the contributions that our community wants to see uplifted and respected and defended by those who seek to represent us.
And Matt, yes, that's important that Clarissa brought up the engagement part. The Latino vote sometimes is supposed to magically appear. Engagement is part of it. What do we get wrong when we talk about the Latino vote or Latino votes?
Well, the first thing I think is we need to stop putting the big capital THE, the, in front of the Latino vote and talk about Latino voters as a plural. Whether we're talking about Cuban Americans in Miami, Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia, or Mexican Americans in Pennsylvania, some of those key battleground states, we're all Latinos, culturally, ethnically, but we're not one vote. And so talking about the Latino vote, I think, is very limiting. And we know that there are different patterns of engagement in each of those communities and different patterns of mobilization. Where campaigns invest and where they invest with cultural competence, you will see that payoff. You'll see increased turnout, you'll see increased support, but our community needs to be engaged. And I think that's something that we learned very effectively in 2020. And I know, speaking about my co-panelist here and friend Chuck Rocha, it's something that he really pushed hard when he was on the Sanders campaign. And we saw that across all the campaigns. Where there was investment, it paid off.
Chuck, you often hit people over the head. Culturally relevant campaign material. You say this over and over again. Latino voters have to be engaged. Where do we get it wrong?
Well, the first thing we get wrong is we don't show up. The average age of a Latino in America is 27 years old. So what the first mistake most campaigns don't do, to Clarissa's point, is they don't even make an attempt to talk to our community, because most 27-year-olds on the voter file don't vote in their opinion. So they go past us to a prime white suburban voter and spend hundreds of millions of dollars walking past our houses and talking to those houses. So part of, to what Matt said, and the reason Bernie did so well, is we showed up, knowing we wouldn't get all the vote, but showing up in those communities. And showing up, let's be clear about this. Showing up doesn't mean just investing in canvassing. Showing up means spending every dollar the same way you spend a dollar to go talk to a white persuadable voter. Well, Chuck, what does that mean? That means TV commercials, radio commercials, digital commercials, mail pieces, text messages, phone calls. And you're like, oh my, Chuck, that seems like a lot. That's exactly what they do when they're going after white prime voters. Why can't we do that with Latinos? And when you do, guess what? You can get 73% of them in Nevada to vote for an old Jewish Democratic Socialist from Vermont, for God's sakes. And if they'll vote for Bernie Sanders, imagine what they do for somebody named Castro or Hernandez or Gonzalez. It's showing up is part of this battle. And knowing when you show up that brown-skinned people in Texas, like me, talk a lot different than brown-skinned folks like Matt from California. We're both Latinos on the voter file, but we are very culturally different, even though we both self-identify. That's cultural competency, and I'm excited, as you can tell, to be a part of this conversation.
Fact check here, right now, there are 2 million Cuban Americans in the country, but there are 33 plus million Mexican Americans. But most of the Mexican Americans are located in Texas, California, non-swing states. Many of the Cuban Americans are in South Florida, a swing state. Many elections focus on the Latino vote very heavily on Florida, not representative of the Latino vote in general or Latino voters in general. What did we miss in 2020? Because I saw this a little bit. What did we get wrong in 2020 when we're talking about Latino voters? Clarissa, I'll go to you first.
I think you're gonna keep hearing us going back to the same things. And while Matt and Chuck lifted up that we are not a monolith, which we agree with, I want to keep emphasizing we're not a monolith, but there are so many issues that where Latino voters agree. The thing that we saw as a common thread, whether you are talking about Latinos in Miami or Latinos in the Rio Grande Valley, we saw two common threads in 2020. One, aggressive disinformation targeting our community to either prevent them from voting or to muddle the issues. And two, lack of outreach from candidates and parties. So the thing goes back to that. People, candidates, parties expect Latinos to show up, but are not persuading these voters to come out. So the first thing for us as a community is that we have to challenge those who call us a sleeping giant. A community with the highest labor force participation and robust service to country is anything but. We're not apathetic. We're unconvinced. And you're talking about Florida. If you look at Florida and Texas, the states with the second and third largest Latino population in the country, Latinos have plenty of evidence there that elected officials don't care about them or are even antagonistic towards them. So our result we are seeing in past elections is actually the community organizing itself to bring those aspirations to the voting booth.
And Matt, on that note, we just recently had the recall election in California. Polls just a few weeks ago showed that Latinos, majority of them, were supportive of the recall. But when it came down to it, they were strongly against the recall. What kind of problems do we have when we're trying to get the pulse of Latino voters, even in California, where one would assume they'd be easy to survey? What do we continue to get wrong?
Well, that's a good point, because those polls going into the recall election last week were just simply not accurate. They were not an accurate reflection of our community. They were not done bilingually. They were not done on the telephone. Many of these were online polls, or they were robocalls. And you need to get into the community. Similar to what Chuck was saying, we need to take that same approach to our research, to go and meet people where they are, understand, and make sure that we have accurate samples. You know, we have put a lot of effort into this in the research we've done. If you don't have accurate samples, accurate focus groups, accurate polls of the Latino community, how do we expect politicians and campaigns to take us seriously? And we saw that in the recall. Lots of really uninformed news coverage of the Latino vote. When what did we find? When looking at the data, looking at the results, our center here at UCLA, the LPPI, we found overwhelmingly 75, 80, in some counties, 85% of the Latino vote voted no on the recall. So it was a very strong vote. It came through, but you didn't see that coming in. And I think that was because mistakes were being made in the way that the Latino vote was being reported on in California. And I hope that we can all do better. Of course, you know, Russell, you've interviewed all of us over the years, and you're one of the, you know, few Latino journalists who gets that. But we don't see enough of that in the media. We see our voices taken for granted of too much in the political reporting.
Chuck, the non-engaged Latino voter, this is somebody you felt that the people really need to aggressively go after. Just in the 2020 election, we found, according to one research study, that the non-engaged Latino voters were aggressively sought by the Trump campaign through YouTube, spreading, in some cases, misinformation, or going directly to them to talk about jobs. What do we need to do to engage the non-engaged Latino voter? I know that's an oxymoron, but they're voting in larger numbers. We're talking about my cousin who works at the hair salon, and my brother who is a mechanic. They want to be engaged, but they go to YouTube for information. What do we need to do to get them?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to show trust. They have to trust you. They have to trust the politician, right? This is a big part of persuasion, but that doesn't start in the last month. We did research after the last election to see that most of the Latino outreach was done in the last 60 days in almost all the campaigns. Joe Biden had started earlier than that, but Joe Biden was the only one really going that early, and a couple Senate races. None of the House races started except the last 30, 35 days if they ran any Spanish language ads at all. While we saw in those same communities this misinformation that Clarissa talked about on YouTube and on radio stations in Miami and in McAllen that had been going on for months and months. On top of that, we weren't canvassing door to door because of COVID. They were, because they didn't care about COVID. So you saw a snowball effect in a very polarizing atmosphere where you saw the perfect storm where 52,000 Latinos in McAllen, in that county, showed up to vote who had not participated in the last two elections. And that blew my mind. So we went down there, we did focus groups, and we talked to folks. And what they said is that they want somebody, whether they're Democrat or Republican, to do something that directly helps them. Clarissa's been talking about this since I've known her. Like, what are you doing to help me and my community? And you can't show up in the last 2 weeks and try to talk me into that. So that's the first lesson, is timing. And the second lesson, to your point about infrequent, is targeting. To what I opened up my statement with by saying, talk to more than just your prime voters. For all you graybeards like me, that means folks who don't just vote in every primary, but my son, who's 30 years old, who votes whenever he feels like he needs to go vote. Those are the folks we should reach out to early and often if we want to see an uptick, because this is how they get young, white, persuadable voters involved, because they live in those houses where their mama and daddy are getting all this information, so they get enough of it to where they become more engaged. The one thing, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, you're crazy. And that's what's been happening with the Latino vote. Latino voters, Matt.
Exactly. In a poll here that we did at Axios, which I discussed on the HBO show, when we surveyed Latinos to see what were the most concerns, on top of their mind, COVID was number one, followed by the economy, race and justice. Immigration was fourth or fifth. Yet when politicians, I'm going to stick with you, Chuck, when they come to us, they want to talk about immigration reform, which is fine. That's an important issue. But
sure,
very difficult if you're going to talk about immigration reform to somebody in Albuquerque whose family has been there, 20 generations allegedly, or to someone in McAllen whose dad works for the Border Patrol. Why do we still stay on immigration, an important issue, and overlook the concerns about jobs, education, race relations, especially for Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans? That's a thought that's sometimes on the forefront of the mind. What are we getting wrong again?
There's nobody that looks like anybody on this panel and a decision-making apparatus in any of those campaigns who can stand up for our community and voice that opinion that all of us know are common sense. And what I mean by that is I went back after the last election just to prove my point and found in the top 30 congressional races, Senate races, and governor's races, there was one Latinx person that was a manager out of 35 races. And of the top consulting firms that were advising those firms, there were 0 that were 100% Latino owned. There was a spattering of there's a Latino partner here or there, and they're great firms, but they can't take up the oxygen in the room. And I've been in that room, Matt's been in that room, and Clarissa's been in that room where there's a decision being made about where to allocate resources. And if one of us aren't there to say, look, are we making sure that we're calling Latinos in Spanish and asking these questions? Because you're running the same ad to white people, you're translating it into Spanish and thinking that they're going to act the same way as their white counterparts. That's the biggest deal, is there's not somebody there to explain to well-meaning white people who want to win, who are good Democrats, but there's not somebody there that can actually voice that opinion. And I found that to be one of many Achilles heels of what's been done historically over time.
On that note, Matt, I've been to a couple of political events in California, and they usually start off with music from Miami, salsa, bachata, and so forth. And I always wondered, why not start off this thing with oldies, or the Art Laveau show? Because as you know, LA Chicanos love oldies. I say that superficially because I think sometimes we're getting transplants into Latino communities who misunderstand them. When you study this population, what are some of the things they want to see from their elected officials or candidates to reach them, to engage them? What are they demanding that these politicians do?
Well, I think the first is just to listen to the Latino community and to reflect Latino perspectives. As both Chuck and Clarice have said, don't just force down a one-size-fits-all or don't make the Latino community an afterthought. Come, campaign, visit, and speak and discuss with our communities, with our families. And then when we're talking about the issues, it's what you said, Russell. It's the COVID pandemic, it's the economy, it's better paying jobs, it's access to healthcare. Those are the bread and butter issues we want to hear about. And I think sometimes when you get outsiders who come in, they say, we need to go tell these Latino voters how important immigration reform is. Yes, we agree. We want to have immigration reform, and we're on the cusp of it right now. But we also need to hear, what is your plan for Latino families to build the economy stronger, to get us better wages? And in a traditional campaign, whether it's a city council race, a House race, a Senate race, they often forget that. They see that as an afterthought, and they only want to talk to us about these stereotypical issues. And that's a mistake. Those issues are important. There's no doubt. And we have great support for them. But that's why sometimes campaigns don't connect quite as well. And I think we're turning a corner on that now. I think people are realizing with the growing Latino vote and the diversity that you need to talk to us about those issues of the day. And when you do, when you treat Latino voters with that same respect that you do with the white suburban swing voters, you're going to win us over, and you're going to see high participation.
And Clarissa, one of the descriptions of Unidos USA, or Unidos, is that you are a civil rights organization. It's right there in the description. It's not just immigration. When you speak to folks on the Capitol and you say we're involved in civil rights, we have unfinished business with civil rights going way back to segregation, how do they respond to you? You're talking about equity and education and political representation, but sometimes that message does not get across. What are their reaction when you say we have other issues we need to address, and it's not just immigration?
The answer is folded in the question that is folded in the answer, right? We are a multi-issue organization. Our community is a multi-issue community. The reality is that we care about immigration because it impacts not only those who are immigrants in our community, but how Latinos are treated. Every time that the immigration debate goes toxic, it undermines the civil rights and civil liberties of all Latinos, regardless of immigration status. That's why it matters, and it packs a powerful punch. But if you look at the last 20 years of polling, even when there was a dearth of polling on Latinos, and that's no longer the case, even 20 years ago, the top issues have tended to be this bread and butter issues like the economy and jobs, access to affordable healthcare, and quality education. Why? Because we need good quality jobs to support our families with dignity. We want quality education so our kids can do better than we did. And we want access to healthcare so that our kids and us can thrive. So all of those things come together. And that's part of the work that we and many other organizations do on the Hill and in the halls of state legislatures to educate those who seek to represent us to do a better job understanding those concerns. The reality is that it's not rocket science. Candidates matter, their positions matter, and meaningful outreach is essential. And we know that sustained, culturally competent work with the community, providing access, tools, and information leads to participation. We have seen that time and time again. The question is why candidates and parties don't see more of their enlightened self-interest in that. And rather than do the work of courting these voters, what we are seeing is actually, like we were seeing in Texas and Arizona and in Florida, actually attempts by elected officials to prevent these folks from getting to the polls altogether.
Let's stay on that note. Redistricting is coming up right after the census, different on various states. Some have independent bodies. Some are just straight up the legislature. What's at stake for redistricting in 2021? And how can Latinos get involved in that process now?
I can start with that. We have to get involved. If it's happening in your state, it is happening in your state. Go get involved, make your voice heard, write letters, see what's happening in your community, because the Latino population grew the entire nation. We know the headline of the census. The entire country only grew because of Latinos and then Asian Americans next as the two leading forces in growing the population. We demand to be reflected in those new congressional and state legislative boundaries. There should be, if this is done fairly, a massive, massive growth in our political representations because you have to draw those districts around our communities. But we know that some states, and Clarissa just mentioned 3 of them, Florida, Texas, and maybe Arizona, where there's an independent commission, we still need to keep an eye on. Some of these states are going to be gerrymandering our communities, and we have to take a very close look at that in redistricting to make sure that we maintain districts where Latinos can have influence.
And Clarissa, go back to you before I go to Chuck. Is redistricting a civil rights issue?
Absolutely. It's about voice, and it's about making sure that communities have equitable voice. And the interesting thing about redistricting, right, is that it would be great to make sure that we have more independent commissions driving this process in more places. Whether it is Democrats that control a legislature or Republicans that control a legislature, I'm not going to say they're both acting in the same manner. But what I would say is that politicians are going to act to preserve their own self-interest, right? And that's why participation from civil society and from our community is so important, so that those holding the cookie jar are distributing the cookies equitably. And so it's important to participate in that and to make sure that communities of color and that Latinos among them are well represented in how these districts are drawn.
And Chuck, I got to ask you this. One of the frustrations in covering politics, let's just stick to New Mexico, for example, the most Hispanic state in the country, but we went a generation without a Latino senator from the state of New Mexico. And whenever I pressed Democrats, Hispanic Democrats on that, and it was like, oh, we had good white Democrats in there. You know, he was a good gringo. Right now in New Mexico, the state Senate controlled by all white elected officials. The biggest cities are 2 white mayors. When, you know, right now redistricting, Latinos are elected in majority Latino districts. But when is it time for us to cross over and say enough with this colonization? It's now time. A lot of times they tell the Latinos, be good Democrats or be good Republicans. When is it time for Latinos to tell white Democrats, you be good Democrats, you be Republicans, let us have a seat at the table. It's now our turn. What should we be thinking about that dynamic right there?
Well, anybody who follows my social media for more than about 30 seconds know I've got some strong opinion on this. And I've been telling woke white folks they need to take their position every day and twice on Sunday and let the Latinos have our shot. But we're not going to wait for them. To Matt and Clarissa's point, is that the growth is so exponential. And for years, Democrats and Republicans have tried to break us up into different little groups and make us fight each other. Where now you see a young group of activists, these dreamers, these immigration activists, these folks are taken to the street. They're demanding. You take that group and put it with groups like Unidos and LULAC and folks who've been around doing this, the old graybeards like me. That's a great coalition. And we are all together on the civil rights that Clarissa is talking about. And we're going to demand a seat at the table more and more. And you're seeing it. To Matt's point, and he alluded to this, things are changing. They're not like they were 10 years ago and 30 years ago when I was working for Ann Richards in Texas when I still had hair and was skinny. Like there was a lot of changes more than just my hair and my weight from then. The whole country has changed. It's become more multicultural, more dynamic, but in a time where you have politicians trying to keep all the power and all the votes, and they try to gerrymander so they never lose that. It's just about their time is up. Because our growth has just grown so much that they can't ignore us just on pure population and the power of those numbers when we engage that young vote.
And Clarissa, on that note, coalition building. That's something that Unidos US says a lot. You've got the banner, Black Lives Matter outside. You're very explicit saying, we don't have the numbers many times, but we need to make coalitions because of politics, but also because it's morally right. How important is coalition building in urban areas, in rural areas for Latinos?
It's critical, but it's not just critical for Latinos, right? I think that, yes, first of all, no one organization, no one community has the power to just say my way or the highway. But even if we did, I would say that that's not what we would want. We need to act to advance and model the behavior we want to see. An America that has a place that in that respects everyone for their contributions, and it has safety and well-being as part of their aspirations. That's why collaboration is important, to understand the needs of our own community and of other communities. You know, I look back at many heroes in our community that came before us, the 10, 20, 50 years of work that have made possible where we stand at this very moment. And I look around me and I see many advocates younger than myself that are going to carry that forward beyond where I stand, and the intersectionality that people are not only living but weaving among our communities. It's not just about demanding a place in exclusion or at the cost of others. Is that Latinos have the ability to contribute and to be co-designers in the future of the country. And it is bringing all those different voices together that is going to make us stronger. That's why we need to fight to preserve one of America's greatest strengths, our diversity.
And Matt, you're involved with something, initiative started by the White House to increase Latino civic participation. This is starting way earlier, before the 2024 election. Talk about what is happening and what is your involvement.
Yeah, that's right, Russell. First, let me just say those were exceptional, inspiring words, Cuddy. So thanks for that that discussion. That was really, really awesome. You know, what we're doing over here is at Building Back Together, the C4 issue advocacy organization. We're trying to uphold and support the Biden-Harris White House policy agenda. And we're starting now. We're not waiting, as you said, until 2023. Chuck alluded to earlier, if you haven't read the report that Chuck put out after the election, it's absolutely critical. Most of those candidates from Congress, Senate, governor, and others, they started so late, extremely late in the cycle. And we're trying to start right now communicating with Latinos. And so we launched the Latino Always On program. And we launched it at the 100 days in office, not 100 days before the next election, 100 days in office. And we brought on partners and people like Solidarity Strategies and Chuck. We also brought in Mosaic and 76 Words and Sena Kozar. We're working with Latino strategists and consultants to start now reaching out and communicating. We need to do more. We need to grow the budget. But this is a good template to start that outreach now and not wait until the end, because we have a lot of new voters. You heard that earlier. Our average age is very young. We have so many first-time voters. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to now walk that walk and say, let's get out there. Let's talk to Latinos about what's at stake, and let's get them engaged, and let's increase our community's involvement.
And Chuck, I know Matt's your boy and all, and you guys talk, you're friends. Is this effort that he's involved with President Biden, is that enough? Is it enough, or is it too soon to say?
Look, I think that you're right. I like Matt Barreto. I think that what he's doing is amazing. I think I like Carissa too. So let's not pit my friends against each other. But I will say this about Building Back Together, which I'm proud to work for. But I'm also knowing that my mouth gets me in trouble a lot because I'm not one to tell you anything that ain't true. And this is what I'll tell you, that's the fact. The fact is that Building Back Together is doing something we've never done before, which is start early, bringing in a bunch of Latino consultants, Latinx consultants from all areas of the country. That's never been done. It is freaking amazing, and I'm super excited. But it ain't enough. And Matt Barreto, me, all these consultants, and the money that we're spending is not enough. Thank God we're doing it, because guess what, boys and girls? We're the only ones talking to Latinos right now. And as our firm, Solidarity, we've had over 100 young Latinos work with us. We're the largest Latino firm. I'm not doing a commercial. I'm telling you to say that I've been around the block, and we worked on 100 races last year. We're a big deal. We work on a lot of stuff. And it's because of that, I get to see all the stuff that's going on right now with what's going on with the Congressional and the Senate races now. And even the parties, to Matt's point, Democrats and Republicans, is that you have Democratic DCCC, DSCC, they're really trying to diversify. They're hiring great staff, they're having great meetings, they're putting people of color in leadership positions. But the thing that worries me that's not changing is in the field at the campaign level that I talked about in the beginning. Those campaign managers, those consultants, because you fall into that same white power structure that leaves out a lot of working class brown people. That's why, let me conclude this with CHCI. That's why, and I was proud to serve on the CHCI board for 8 years. It was some of the best work I ever did as a young organizer, was to be on the national board. And this program they have where they bring Latinos to DC and they let them work in Congress and pay them as fellows, that's how we change this. And CHCI has had a big hand in changing that. But again, it's just CHCI and a handful of groups like Unidos that do that kind of work by mentoring young Latinos and getting them into this power structure, which is Congress. We need more of that if we really want to see bigger change, so that these congressional and Senate races on the ground can echo what Building Back Together is doing and what the D-TRIP and the DS is trying to do at the same time.
And Clarissa, I want to end this with you. One of the things we haven't talked about is gender. We have one Latina in the U.S. Senate. We have one Latino governor. We're still way short of where we need to be for gender parity in elected officials, but we are seeing record numbers of Latinos run for office and get elected to Congress. What still needs to be done to address the gender disparities in our communities? Yes, we're more advanced than we were 40 years ago, but we're not there yet. What do we need to do?
We need to put our aspirations into structures. I am fortunate to be at an organization, the helm of which is a Latina leader, an organization who was one of the first ones to put in place, as part of its board, stipulations for gender equity. And it connects back also to what Chuck was saying in terms of building pipelines, right? When we go back to why isn't there more diversity among elected officials and in the parties? What are they doing to recruit and train more people for those pipelines? It has to do with that. If you look at organization in the social justice area, the majority are women, right? So many of us need to be encouraged more to also look at running for office and then be provided the supports, the information, the tools, and the supports, just like our voters, to be able to do that. Ultimately, I think that we are going to keep fighting to make sure that we get to a point where both parties and their candidates are fighting aggressively for the support of our voters. And as part of that, we as organizations and as individuals, members of our community, need to continue the work, because the reason we're seeing more of that is not just because of the altruism of the parties and candidates, is because we have been pushing to organize ourselves and to hold them accountable to do better.
And Matt, the final 30 seconds we have before we go to questions. Colleges are seeing way more Latinas than they are Latinos. They're being active in all levels of university life. What are you seeing there at UCLA?
There's no question about that, Russell. We have huge enrollment numbers across the UC systems and other colleges across America with Hispanic students, but it is being led by Latinas. We have much higher rates of enrollment and graduation. And so that's encouraging. That's wonderful that we're seeing that. But we need to not leave behind the Latino men who maybe are not making the community college transfer or who are taking a new job to support their family. What we're seeing is increased educational attainment by Latinos faster than what the census predicted, but we need to continue investing in this community, and we need to do that across all colleges, not just here at UCLA. All colleges across America need to be reaching out and bringing more Latinas and Latinos in.
Questions from the audience. We've talked a lot about Mexican American, Cuban representation. Central American is one of the fastest growing segment of Latinos, so are Dominicans, but we only have one Dominican in Congress. We only have one or two Central Americans in Congress. They're vastly disproportionately underrepresented in state legislatures. local officials, what could we be doing more to engage our Central American and Dominican brothers and sisters to get involved and get elected to office? I'll start with you, Chuck.
I think it's important to realize why that is. And so what you're seeing from a pure political standpoint is Central Americans and other folks from Central America move into a place like Maryland or move into a place in Nebraska. And they're all in an area that's geographically close. Well, politicians see that, and it's all Republican for the most part held areas. And that's why this census is so important in redistricting, because what the politicians will do is go in there and break up those communities where they really don't have power because they're not all in the same district, to keep them disconnected from each other. So civic engagement, to Clarissa's point, is a huge part of community-based organizing when it comes to these communities. And these communities are some of the best organized. They're newer immigrants. They've been fighting longer than a 3-generation Mexican like me who take a lot for granted wrongly. And so this group is hungry to be organized and be organized with. But a lot of the other groups, none of the groups here, CHCI, Unidos, other groups, they're doing this work. And there's new Latino groups popping up all the time in Eastern Pennsylvania and Maryland just to organize these groups. But getting them some kind of a win is a big deal. People forget how good it feels to win. And sometimes we need to go in and have a local win when we're just looking at trying to win a congressional seat or a Senate race. Let's go in and put something on the ballot about our water and keeping our water clean or whatever the local issue is, where these folks feel like they can feel and touch a win that touches their life. And we've seen that go into a snowball effect to really affect what's happening in mobilization in these Central American communities.
And Matt, sometimes I get hit on social media from Central Americans who say, your coverage or this story is framed with the Mexican hegemony at stake. We're marginalizing Central American voices. It hurts, but they have a point there. What can we do more to engage? And even if we tell white folks to step aside and let us run things, sometimes we need to step aside and say, you know what, you're right. Central Americans need a seat at this table for, and sometimes be an opportunity to lead. What should we be doing more to engage Central Americans?
Well, I think the first is recognizing the population growth in our communities. We're going to see that in the Census 2020 numbers when the ethnic origin data comes out, that the Central American population has been growing by very large numbers within the Latino community. Here at UCLA, we've actually taken the step last year of changing our department name, of which I'm a member, from the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies to the Department of Chicano and Central American Studies. And we have integrated into all of our coursework a minimum of at least 30% focus on Central American Studies and Central American communities. We have a department chair of Chicano and Central American Studies who is a Central American leader and scholar. So we have to do the work. We have to make sure that these communities are understood, that they're reflected. We know what happened in 2018. They bore the brunt of the racist, anti-immigrant rhetoric of the Central American caravan that was called by Republicans. This was unacceptable. We saw the same thing in Virginia with the racist ads against MS-13. So Central Americans are certainly being politically activated. And now the rest of us, other Latinos who may not be Central American, need to recognize that and I think find ways to integrate their narratives and their presence in our politics.
Clarissa, a question for you. And this could be something with the advocacy that Unidos US is doing. How will new voter restrictions law in states like Florida, Texas, Arizona impact Latino voters, and what should be done about it?
So how will they impact is a story that is still to be written. And I say that because what we can say is, what is the intention that is frankly transparent, right? So the intention, as we mentioned before, is to stunt the voice of these communities in the voting booth, period. We have seen increasing participation, and rather than actually roll up sleeves and these politicians that are driving these restrictions, focusing their energy in courting these voters, they're actually trying to prevent people from getting to the voting booth. The reason that I say the story is yet to be written is because last year, in the midst of a pandemic, we saw Latinos turn out in record numbers. And part of the reason was because there was such a broad and concerted effort by groups, national, state, and local, in many states, to make sure that our communities' voters had information about how to navigate voting during the pandemic. First, getting registered to vote. Second, understanding the different ways they could vote and be able to do it safely. I think we're going to need the same kind of concerted effort to fight these attempts to quiet our voice. So they will have an impact. You could have seen greater numbers perhaps, but I think that we are also deriving energy in the fact that somos tercos. Y menos quieren que hagamos algo, más lo vamos a hacer. So the more they want us not to vote, the more they need to respond and show that that's not going to make the difference that they're expecting. We are going to show up.
Chuck, last question here. Okay, I'm sold. I really want to help. I want to help in getting my candidate to Latino Votes engaged. But what are some of the best practices that result in higher voting Latino precincts turnout? Can these practices be replicated in low voting Latino precincts? If I'm willing to put the money and time, what do I need to do?
I've got a checklist for you, Russell, and it's a great question, and I'll make this real simple for everybody. I may or may not have wrote a whole book about this that you can go buy that tells you everything, and I open sourced it because I didn't care who you was hiring. Do it the right way, and please get and go talk to our folks. Well, it starts with targeting the voter. That means broaden your target and talk to lots of people. And if you're like, well, what does that mean, Chuck? Well, sure, go talk to Latinos who always go vote because we need to persuade them, and we may have lost some of them. But they have a lot of kids who live in their household who aren't voting. That would be my first target of the potential voters. Next are newly registered people who nobody is talking to, all of these being Latinos, right? Spread out your targets. Second thing, start early. I'm going to harp on it. You can never get there too early. Be like Unidos, be organizing the community and just never leave. That's the great model and why Unidos has done the work that they have done. Is there year-round organizing, be talking to the communities year-round. If it's not about politics, have a soccer tournament, give food to the Goodwill, build somebody a house, but be there in the community building trust. And the next piece, which is pretty simple, is rewrite all of your material in Spanish. Don't translate it. And I know for all of us, we're like, duh, Chuck. Well, believe it or not, as the guy who works with campaigns, it happens every single day. Have your campaigns rewrite it the way it sounds in Spanish, not the way it translates into Spanish. And if you're deciding whether to do, should I talk to these brown people in English? Should I talk to these brown people in Spanish? Do it both. Do both of them. It helps you offend anybody, right? I love in my office, keep in mind, my business partner, former CHCI intern, my other vice president's El Salvadorian, the other vice president's from Venezuela. I've got a full-time staffer who lives on the island in Puerto Rico. I love watching those kids sit around a big table and argue about the 5 different ways to say the one Spanish word and which one do we use on the mail piece. That's when you know you're winning. That's how you know you're doing it right, when you have that kind of discussion going on. So let me just leave you with that. Do it and have a little cultural competency.
Absolutely. When you're going something to East Harlem, do not say "Cómo estás?" Say "Cómo está?" And I think you'll
Right.
go a long way there. I want to
That's
give
right.
everybody a chance for closing remarks. Clarissa, I'll start with you. What final piece of advice would you give Latino voters who want to mobilize their interest? We're talking a lot about candidates. What if a Latino voter wants to say, okay, I want you to listen to me. Well, how do I get them to listen to me? What should they do?
We need to show up. We need to show up en las calles, en las casillas, y en el Congreso, on the streets, in the voting booth, and in the halls of Congress and state legislatures. I think we need to reject the mentality of scarcity. So I would just challenge my co-panelists on the stand aside to others. It's about creating space. There's enough space for all of us. So let's create and hold space to make sure that the voices that have not been heard are being heard. But let's show up and help our friends and family navigate the same processes that others have helped us navigate. And let's keep that going, porque Roma no se hizo en un día, and this is going to take paso a pasito, poco a poquito, but we are already demonstrating the progress to get there.
Chuck, real quick, any last bit of advice?
Don't forget about the next generation. Think about that kid you're sitting next to who may not be as dark as you, as light as you, who may talk funny like me, who may speak perfect Spanish, or guess what? May not know Spanish at all, and they're really embarrassed about that. Invite them in. People, and there's so much hate in the world right now, and bitterness and partisanship. People at the end of the day, to Clarissa's point, they just want to help their family, have more bread, make sure that they can get to school, make sure that there's no crime. And we could get there by being a lot nicer to each other and looking for commonality and what brings us together instead of the things that separate us.
Matt, bring us home and motivate us. Give us some advice.
All right, thanks. And first of all, thank you, Russell, for leading this discussion. And thanks to the CHCI. This was great. I learned a lot from listening to Chuck and Clarissa, and I was happy to be here. I think the most important thing is to remember our numbers are going to keep growing. The Latino vote increased by 30% in just 4 years, and it's projected to increase by another 30% by the next 4 years. And it's going to keep going after that. The Latino vote could double within 20 years. We have a lot of future potential power right here, but we have to harness it. We have to have campaigns listen to us. And then as Clarissa said, we have to take the initiative to get out and vote. And those numbers are powerful. We are going to continue transforming America through our voice and through our vote.
Thank you so much for our excellent panelists, Clarissa, Matt, and Chuck. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you, all of you, for attending CHCI's Leadership Conference. Please keep tweeting about the summit and share your thoughts at CHCIHHM21. Make sure you check out the closing plenary session up next on 20th century technology and innovation in American energy. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us.